down. So the word I was given to reflect on really is vulnerability. So we're thinking about this story of Jesus serving up breakfast on the beach. And I thought, well, let's start with who we are. Well, we're people, aren't we? We have bodies that need feeding. We need adequate rest, sleep, exercise, interesting things to think about. I remember my nana saying after my grandpa died that she really missed touch. Like, skin is important. We have skin. She needed touch, so I'd stroke her hair and rub her shoulders because that was her mode of connection. And we are curious, we're creative, we're innovative, kind, we can be caring, compassionate. And when God made people, he said, people are very good. We're made in God's image. Collectively, we are the body of Christ, but we are not God. We make mistakes and get things wrong. And even with the best of intentions, things don't quite go the way we'd hoped. We have limited knowledge, limited understanding, and I think this is partly because we stand in a very fixed point, a fixed place, a fixed time. We have our culture, our biases, often unconscious, and I know energy is limited. I know my energy is limited, and we get poorly, and our reserves are finite. So yes, we have these godlike qualities, but we are most definitely not God. And then let's take a look at Jesus, fully human and fully God. And in our story of the big catch of fish and the barbecue on the beach, here is Jesus, crucified and resurrected Jesus, cooking breakfast for his friends. And the fishermen have been out all night and have caught nothing. I imagine they're very tired and very despondent. And then Jesus does a miracle. Throw your net on the right side of the boat. And they do. And the miracles aren't over. Have faith, and yes, it is me. But the restoration doesn't stop there. He calls out, bring some fish to be cooked. Bring what you've got. You've got something of value to offer. And he says, let me feed you. Your bodies matter. Rest and eat. And I came across something recently which, well, personally I found quite curious and quite interesting. And back in the days of the early church, Christians were often called atheists. So, well, that's interesting. That's a different way of looking at it. But it's because the Christians refused to offer kind of food to the gods of the time. And other people were worried about this, worried you're not appeasing the gods properly, what's going to happen? And yet here's Jesus, this God one, feeding people, feeding us. And it's something we remember every time we share communion. God is the one who feeds us, who nurtures us. And for some people, they might remember that every time they sit down for a meal together. They remember God, or they say grace. We remember God's provision. There's another image as well. I'm kind of going to skip forward a little bit because in 1 Peter 2, I just came across this recently as well, Peter uses the metaphor of being like newborn infants. And in that passage, Jesus is being imaged as a mother, like a mother feeding her baby. This is like quite radical at a time when, like, even the Apostle Paul was using contemporary cultural imagery to say, you know, move on beyond milk, you eat solids. He was using that kind of cultural imagery that people would have got. Peter is subverting massively here, just like Jesus did. Jesus said, let the little children come to me. You know, it's the children who know the way. Like, let them come to me. And Peter, he spent time with Jesus. And I think later on in his journey, having been through the little bit of the story I'm going to go back to, he has the humility now to recognise that he is something like that himself. And we're being invited to be like that, to call on Jesus, to So it says, we're exhorted to desire the pure spiritual milk. And this Peter, it feels a long way from the Peter who cut off the guard's ear when Jesus was arrested. But Peter's been walking with Jesus. He's heard his teaching about letting the children come to him. And he knew that we had to become like children to enter the kingdom of heaven. And I think there's an inherent honesty within this image. On the one hand, it's a beautiful image, isn't it? Babies who can just feed and call on their mum like that. There's a comfort and a satisfaction. But if you've been in a house with a hungry baby, they're crying the roof down. They will not give up or relent until they've had that one thing that they need. There's a raw honesty to that cry. And I think Peter's come to know something of that raw honesty before God as well. And I think we aren't asked to be polite or to hide or to come in when it's convenient or when it's it's okay in God's timing. We are asked to come as we are when we need to. There's almost a brutalness about it. You come to God because you need God. You come to Jesus because you need Jesus to feed you. There's a humility, there's a vulnerability in that. And I think there is something about the honesty within the honesty that helps us to trust God more. If we come to God in that point of need and God meets us in that point of need, then it's we learn to trust God that little bit more. And the more of our lives we can bring to God, the more integrated our whole lives become. And I think also the more sacred we begin to realise our whole lives are. And I'm going to go back now, because I've rushed ahead a little bit. So we've had breakfast. Jesus has said, you bring some of the fish to be cooked. Bring something of what you've got. You've got something of value to offer. I will feed you. Yes, your bodies matter. Yes, rest. Yes, eat. Yes, we will have breakfast. And then he goes that step further, doesn't he? Because he restores Peter. Peter, who I imagine is hugely disappointed with himself for letting Jesus down, even though Jesus told him he would. Jesus said, you will deny me, and that is exactly what happened. But he restores Peter, and he restores him in front of the other disciples as well. And it's quite even that itself is quite an interesting passage, isn't it? It says, so when they had eaten, this is an amplified Bible version, the classic edition. When they had eaten, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And in brackets it says, these others do. And it goes on to kind of expand that word love with reasoning, intentional spiritual devotion as one loves the Father. And Peter responds that I have a deep instinctive personal affection for you as a close friend. And different versions translate that slightly differently. I think when Jesus is asking, do you love me? I think it's that word agape or agapeo maybe in this particular version. Do you love me? I think what he's saying is, do you love me as I love the Father? Do you love me with that level of love? Do you love me with that level of devotion? Like Jesus loves the Father. Jesus has been completely obedient. Jesus has been He's walked his road. He's completed what he came to earth to do. Do you love me as I love the Father? And Peter says, I love you as a dear friend. He offers him the best he can. I love you with deep affection as a close friend. And I think Jesus accepts that because he begins reinstating Peter. He begins recommissioning Peter. He says, feed my lambs. That's verse 15. And in verse 16, Jesus repeats his question. And I'm going to paraphrase it because this is how I'm thinking about it. He says, do you love me as I love my Father? It's that level of intensity. And again, Peter says, I love you with deep affection. He offers what he can. I love you as my dear closest friend. And I think Jesus accepts it. He says, shepherd my sheep or tend to my sheep. And in the third time, I think Jesus comes down to Peter's level. I don't think there's judgment here. Sometimes, and even some translations and paraphrases almost like layer this with a level of judgment from Jesus. I'm not reading that. I think Jesus comes down to Peter's level and he says, do you love me as a close and dear friend? Do you have that level of connection and warmth towards me? That's what Peter's been able to offer so far, and that's what Jesus comes down to. He says, do you love me like that? And Peter says, yes, I love you like that. And again, he receives what Peter can offer at that point, and he says, feed my sheep. 3 denials, 3 reinstatements. Jesus has restored Peter, but he hasn't required Peter to be more than he can be in that moment. He's received the love he's able to offer him in that moment. And Jesus does look ahead, and he seems to hint at this way that he will be martyred further down the line. He seems to say, you will be crucified like me. That seems to be the intention behind his words. So in some ways, I think he's saying, you love me with this warm affection, and that is enough for now. And I receive that from you now, and I will reinstate my commission to you exactly where you are now. But there's also hidden a promise that you will love me as I love the Father. And that is where we're heading. There's just a couple more small things. I know when I was a teenager, a lot of my friends use very colourful language. Well, I never did. I was always very careful in how I put things and phrased things. My parents were very careful in how they spoke. My grandparents were a little bit more colourful, but they tried to hide it from us. But when I became a Christian, I swore like mad at God repeatedly. And it wasn't that I was upset at God. It wasn't that I was angry at God. It wasn't that I didn't like God. It's just that God was big enough to take it. Like, if God's love is that big and that vast, like literally like an ocean, then my little pebbles of whatever intensity is like a tiny ripple. It's nothing. And I think that helped me trust God a lot, because God could hold it. God could hold me, all of me, whatever that looked like. And it was a very safe space to be. And I was at some work-related training recently, listening to someone, and I just felt he spoke with a certain honesty and a certain vulnerability. And I think there's something about owning your own story and being comfortable with your own story that frees other people up as well. So maybe there's something in being vulnerable before God and owning that and being okay with that and knowing that God is okay with that, that can release other people to be the people that they also need to be.